Hey everyone, welcome back to LGBT Stories, where we share emotional, romantic, and sometimes heart-wrenching tales from the LGBT community. Today, I'm bringing you a story that's incredibly powerful and deeply personal. It's about a bond that transcends family ties and touches the very core of what it means to love and be loved. Get ready for a journey that will take you through laughter, tears, and moments of profound connection. Let's dive into this true gay love story. A couple of weeks ago, my nephew asked me something so crazy it caught me off guard. However, when I reconsidered, I decided to accept his offer, and it turned out to be one of the best decisions of my life. It was exciting. Let me take you back to where it all started. The weekend had begun just as most family weekends did, with laughter echoing through the house and the familiar clatter of dishes as dinner was prepared. My sister Sarah had come over with her family for a long overdue visit. Her son Jake, my 20-year-old nephew, was hanging along as usual. His easygoing charm filled the spaces between conversations. Jake had grown up before my eyes, and watching him transform from an awkward teen into a confident young man always left me in awe. Over the years, we'd built a special bond, one that went beyond the typical uncle and nephew dynamic. I like to think of him as not just family, but also a friend, someone I could laugh with and share stories about life. That night, as the dinner plates were cleared and the children played in the living room, Jake and I ended up in the kitchen alone. Sarah and her husband were chatting on the back porch. Their voices were a gentle hum against the backdrop of the crickets outside. It was one of those serene evenings where time seemed to stretch out, the moments lingering like honey on a spoon. "You always make the best lasagna, Uncle Alex," Jake said, leaning against the counter with a mischievous grin. "You should give Mom the recipe. Hers could use a little help." I chided him, swatting him lightly with a dish towel. "That's not a very nice thing to say." He laughed, the sound warm and full of life. "I'm just saying it like it is. Besides, you know you're everyone's favorite cook. Flattery will get you nowhere," I teased, though his compliment brought a smile to my face. As I turned back to the sink, rinsing the last of the dishes, I felt his gaze lingering. It wasn't unusual. Jake was observant by nature, always noticing the little things that others might overlook. But tonight, his attention felt different, heavier somehow, as if there was something he wanted to say, but didn't know how. "Do you need something?" I asked over my shoulder, keeping my tone light. He hesitated, and when I glanced back, his usual confident expression had been replaced with something more uncertain. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice quieter now. I turned to face him fully, drying my hands on a towel. "Of course. What's on your mind?" He didn't answer right away. His fingers drummed lightly against the countertop as he seemed to gather his thoughts. I don't know how to say this," he began, his words halting. "But I feel like you're the only person I can talk to about it." There was an earnestness in his tone that made my chest tighten. "Whatever it is, you can tell me," I assured him. "I'm here for you." Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's just lately I've been feeling a little lost. I guess I'm stuck between being a kid and figuring out how to be an adult, and I don't know if I'm doing any of it right." His confession was both surprising and endearing. Jake had always seemed so self-assured, but now seeing this vulnerable side of him, I felt a surge of protectiveness. I stepped closer, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "That's completely normal," I said gently. "Growing up isn't easy, and there's no manual for it. You're doing just fine." He looked up at me then, his blue eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and something else I couldn't quite place. "Thanks, Uncle Alex. That means a lot." There was a beat of silence as we stood there, and for a moment, the world outside seemed to fade away. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint laughter from the living room, it all melted into the background as our eyes met. I felt an unexpected warmth spread through me, a connection that went beyond the usual affection I felt for him. I broke the moment with a light laugh, stepping back and grabbing the dish towel again. "You're a good kid, Jake. You just need to give yourself some credit." "Thanks," he said again, his voice softer now. We finished tidying up together, the atmosphere between us shifting back to its usual easygoing rhythm. But as the evening went on, I couldn't shake the memory of that moment in the kitchen, the way his eyes had searched mine, the way my heart had skipped a beat. It was nothing, I told myself. Just a moment of connection, a testament to the bond we shared. But deep down, I knew there was more to it than that. The evening drifted on, and as the family gathered in the living room, the warmth of shared laughter filled the space. Jake sat on the floor, leaning back against the couch where I was seated. His presence was comforting in a way I couldn't quite articulate, though I found myself hyper-aware of every small movement he made, how his shoulder brushed against my leg, or the way his laughter lingered a moment longer when I joined in. Sarah and her husband announced they were heading upstairs to settle the kids for bed, leaving Jake and me alone in the cozy glow of the room. The remnants of the evening, a few glasses on the coffee table, and the faint scent of dinner painted the picture of a home at rest. Jake turned his head to glance at me, his expression playful yet curious. "You look like you're a million miles away, Uncle Alex," he said. I smiled, shaking off the wandering thoughts that had consumed me. "Just thinking about how much work it's going to take to clean up tomorrow," I lied, hoping to steer the conversation towards something lighter. "Let me help," he offered, sitting up straighter. "You've already done enough. You don't have to." I began, but he was already gathering the glasses and heading toward the kitchen. I followed him, unable to suppress a small laugh at his determination. "I insist," he said over his shoulder, setting the glasses in the sink. "You're too kind," I teased, leaning against the counter. "But I won't argue." As we worked side by side, washing and drying the dishes, the easy rhythm of our movements created a sense of calm. But beneath the surface, there was an undercurrent of something unspoken, a tension that seemed to hum in the air between us. I caught him watching me once or twice, his gaze lingering just a little too long before he quickly turned back to his task. "Do you ever feel like you're just going through the motions?" he asked suddenly, his voice thoughtful. I paused, surprised by the question. "Sometimes," I admitted. "Why do you ask?" He shrugged, his expression pensive. "I don't know. Lately, it feels like everyone expects me to have it all figured out, but I'm just coasting. I guess doing what's expected without really knowing if it's what I want." His words struck a chord within me, echoing feelings I'd buried deep over the years. "You're not alone in that," I said softly. "Life has a way of pushing us in certain directions, but it's okay to take your time figuring out what's right for you." He nodded, his gaze steady on mine. "That's what I like about you, Uncle Alex. You get it. You don't pretend to have all the answers, but you always seem to know the right thing to say." His sincerity caught me off guard, and I felt a warmth rise in my cheeks. "Thank you, Jake. That means a lot." We finished the dishes in comfortable silence, the unspoken connection between us stronger than ever. As I dried my hands on a towel, he leaned back against the counter, his arms crossed casually. "You're really easy to talk to, you know that?" I chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. "Well, I've had plenty of practice. You and your cousins have given me lots of opportunities over the years." "No," he said, his tone more serious now. "I mean it. It's different with you. I feel like I can be myself." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I searched his face for a sign of what he was trying to convey, but his expression was unreadable. "I'm glad you feel that way," I said carefully. "You can always talk to me, Jake, about anything." His lips curved into a small, almost shy smile. "I'll hold you to that." The moment lingered, the weight of his words settling between us. My heart thudded in my chest, and I struggled to keep my composure. Whatever was happening between us was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It was unsettling yet strangely exhilarating, and I didn't know how to navigate the unfamiliar terrain. Jake broke the silence with a light laugh, stepping away from the counter. "I think I'm going to head to bed. Thanks for letting me vent tonight." "Anytime," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. As he left the kitchen, I leaned against the counter, letting out a shaky breath. The house was quiet now, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. My mind raced with thoughts I couldn't fully articulate, a jumble of emotions that left me feeling both exhilarated and deeply conflicted. I made my way upstairs, the soft creak of the floorboards under my feet breaking the stillness. Passing Jake's room, I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorframe. But then I shook my head, continuing down the hall to my own room. Whatever was happening between us, I needed to figure it out before it went any further. But as I lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the memory of Jake's words, the way he'd looked at me, the unspoken tension that seemed to bind us together. It was dangerous, I knew, but it was also undeniable. And deep down, I wasn't sure I wanted it to stop. The following morning started like any other, with the quiet hum of activity as the house slowly came to life. I busied myself in the kitchen, preparing breakfast for everyone while the sounds of children's laughter echoed faintly from upstairs. Despite the normality of the morning, my mind remained restless, replaying the previous night in an endless loop. Jake appeared in the doorway, his hair still tousled from sleep and a relaxed smile on his face. "Morning, Uncle Alex," he said, his voice warm. "Good morning," I replied, my heart giving an involuntary flutter at his presence. He moved to the coffee maker, pouring himself a cup and leaning casually against the counter. "Need any help?" he asked. "I think I've got it under control," I said, offering a small smile. "But thanks." He lingered for a moment, his eyes scanning the room before settling on me. "Last night really helped talking to you. I'm glad I did," he said sincerely, though the weight of his word from the night before still lingered in the back of my mind. "Sometimes all we need is someone to listen," I said. "You're good at that." His gaze was steady, listening and understanding. I felt my cheeks warm under his attention, but before I could respond, Sarah and her husband entered the kitchen, their presence breaking the quiet moment between us. He gave me a small smile before stepping away, leaving me to finish preparing breakfast. As the day wore on, I found myself avoiding being alone with him, unsure of how to navigate the growing tension between us. It wasn't just in my head. I could feel it in the way his eyes lingered on mine, in the small, almost imperceptible shifts in his demeanor when we were near each other. It was as though an invisible thread bound us together, pulling us closer despite my attempts to keep a safe distance. That evening, the house settled into its usual rhythm. Sarah and her husband retired early, and the children were tucked into bed, leaving the two of us alone in the quiet living room. I pretended to read a book, though I couldn't focus on the words. My attention was instead drawn to Jake, who sat on the floor with a sketch pad balanced on his knees. "You're really focused," I said, breaking the silence. He looked up, surprised but pleased by the attention. "Just trying to finish this piece," he said, tilting the sketch pad to show me his work. It was a landscape, intricate and detailed, the kind of art that seemed to breathe life into the page. "That's beautiful," I said, genuinely impressed. "Thanks," he said, his smile widening. "I've been working on it for a while. Drawing helps me think." I nodded, setting my book aside. "What are you thinking about?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the sketch pad. "A lot of things," he said finally, "mostly about how things feel different lately." "Different? How so?" I asked, though I already had a sense of what he meant. "Like I'm seeing things in a new light," he said, his voice quieter now. "People, relationships, what I want out of life." There was a vulnerability in his words that made my chest tighten. I wanted to offer him guidance, to help him make sense of the emotions he was grappling with, but I was struggling to make sense of my own. "That's part of growing up," I said softly. "Learning who you are and what matters to you." He set the sketch pad aside, shifting to face me fully. "It's more than that, though," he said, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. "It's about you." The air between us seemed to crackle with tension, and I found myself unable to look away. "Jake," I began, but he interrupted me. "I know this is wrong," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. "But I can't pretend I don't feel the way I do." My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt my carefully constructed composure begin to crack. "You don't mean that," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "I do," he said firmly. "You've always been there for me, Uncle Alex. You've always understood me in a way no one else does. And I can't stop thinking about you." His confession left me reeling, a mix of emotions swirling within me. Fear, confusion, longing. I wanted to tell him to stop, to draw a line that couldn't be crossed, but the intensity of his gaze held me captive. "This isn't right," I said finally, my voice trembling. "We can't." "Why not?" he asked, his tone earnest. "Because it's not what people expect. Because it's not normal." "I don't care about any of that," he said. I care about you. The sincerity in his voice made my chest ache, and for a moment, I couldn't find the strength to argue. The walls I had built around myself, the boundaries I tried to maintain, felt fragile, ready to crumble at the slightest touch. We can't, I repeated, though the words sounded hollow even to my own ears. He reached for my hand, his touch gentle but grounding. Tell me you don't feel it too, he said quietly. Tell me and I'll stop. I stared at him, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. I wanted to deny it, to push him away and restore the balance we had both disrupted, but the truth was undeniable, written in the way my heart raced at his touch, the way his presence filled a void I hadn't realized was there. I can't, I admitted, the words barely audible. The silence that followed was heavy, the weight of our shared confession pressing down on us. He moved closer, his hand still holding mine, and I felt the pull of something I couldn't explain, something I couldn't resist. We can figure this out, he said softly, his voice steady and sure. I wanted to believe him, to let myself be swept away by the possibility of something new, something real, but the risks were too great, the consequences too dire. Yet as I sat there, my hand in his, I couldn't bring myself to let go. Though my instincts told me to pull away, I couldn't. The warmth of his touch grounded me, even as my mind raced with the implications of everything we had just admitted. We can't, I said again, my voice barely above a whisper, but there was no conviction behind the words. Jake turned to me, his gaze steady and unyielding. Why do we keep saying that, Uncle Alex? We both know it's not how we really feel. Because it's the truth, I said, though my voice trembled. It's complicated. It's impossible. Nothing's impossible, he said softly. Not when it feels like this. The sincerity in his tone made my chest ache. And for a moment, I was overwhelmed by the weight of my emotions. I wanted to believe him, to let myself lean into the connection we shared, but the fear of what it might mean held me back. You don't understand what you're saying, I said, shaking my head. You're young, Jake. You have your whole life ahead of you. So do you, he countered. Why should we spend it pretending, hiding from what we want? His words hit me like a jolt, and I turned to him, my heart racing. Jake, we can't just ignore the consequences. There's too much at stake. He leaned closer, his voice soft but firm. What if we didn't have to ignore it? What if we just tried? I began to speak, but the words faltered as he reached up, his hand brushing gently against my cheek. The touch was electric, sending a shiver down my spine. I wanted to pull away, to restore the boundaries that had been so thoroughly blurred, but the pull of his presence was too strong. I closed my eyes, my breath hitching as I felt his hand linger. The warmth of his skin ignited something deep within me. Just one moment, he whispered. One moment to see if this is real. My heart pounded in my chest, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I knew I should say no, should end this before it went any further. But the vulnerability in his voice, the quiet hope in his gaze, made it impossible to refuse. Jake, I said softly, my voice trembling. This isn't. Before I could finish, his lips met mine in a kiss that was both hesitant and filled with unspoken emotion. The world seemed to stop as the warmth of his touch enveloped me. The quiet stillness of the house amplified the intensity of the moment. I froze at first, my mind racing with the implications of what was happening, but as the kiss deepened, I felt myself melting into it. The barriers I tried so hard to maintain crumbled under the weight of my own desires. It was reckless and wrong, but in that moment, it felt like the only thing that made sense. When we finally pulled away, we were both breathless, our foreheads resting together as we tried to steady ourselves. This is insane, I whispered, my voice shaky. I know, he said, his own breathing uneven, but it feels right. The intensity of his gaze made my chest tighten, and I found myself unable to look away. We can't keep doing this, I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Then tell me to stop, he said simply, and I will. I stared at him, the words caught in my throat. I wanted to say it, to end this before it went any further, but the truth was I didn't want him to stop. The connection we shared, the way he made me feel, it was something I couldn't bring myself to let go of. Instead of answering, I leaned in, capturing his lips in another kiss. This time there was no hesitation, no second-guessing. I let myself get lost in the moment, the weight of my fears and doubts fading into the background as I surrendered to the emotions coursing through me. The night unfolded in a blur of whispered words and quiet touches, each moment more intense than the last. We moved carefully, aware of the risks, but unable to resist the pull of each other's presence. It was as though the world outside didn't exist, leaving only the two of us in the quiet cocoon of the living room. As the hours passed, the weight of our actions began to settle over me, a quiet reminder of the consequences we would eventually have to face. But for now, I pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the warmth of his presence, the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. Eventually, we went further than just kissing and cuddling. We went way further. I don't even know how to talk about it. I feel like I should feel guilty or wrong about it, because I am his uncle. When we both finished, we stayed silent for a moment, just laying there and realizing what had just happened. A couple of hours later, the first rays of dawn filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the room. The quiet hum of the early morning was a stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions that had consumed the night. Jake and I sat together on the couch, the weight of what we had done pressing down on us like a heavy blanket. Neither of us spoke at first. The silence between us was heavy, filled with unspoken words and unanswered questions. I glanced at Jake, his profile illuminated by the faint morning light. His expression was thoughtful, his gaze fixed on the floor as though searching for something he couldn't find. "I should go," he said finally, his voice quiet. I nodded, though the thought of him leaving sent a pang of sadness through me. "It's probably for the best." He turned to me, his eyes filled with a mix of regret and longing. "I don't regret it," he said softly. I don't know what happens now." His honesty was both comforting and unsettling, a reflection of my own conflicted feelings. I reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "Neither do I admitted. "But we need to figure it out." Jake nodded, his gaze lingering on me for a moment before he stood. He hesitated, as though he wanted to say something more, but instead he leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to my forehead. "Goodbye, Uncle Alex," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Goodbye, Jake," I replied, my voice trembling as I watched him walk away. The sound of the door clicking shut behind him was like a final punctuation mark, the end of a chapter that I wasn't sure I was ready to close. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty space where he had been. My thoughts were a tangled mess of emotions. The days that followed were a blur of routine and quiet introspection. Jake kept his distance, his usual visits to the house replaced by polite texts and brief phone calls. Mark, oblivious as ever, continued with his usual habits. His presence in the house was as distant as it had always been. I threw myself into my work, trying to drown out the memories of that night. But no matter how much I tried to distract myself, the weight of what had happened lingered, a constant reminder of the line we had crossed. One afternoon, as I was folding laundry, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from Jake. "Can we talk?" My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, I considered ignoring it. But the thought of leaving things unresolved was unbearable. I typed out a quick reply, my fingers trembling. We met at a quiet coffee shop on the outskirts of town, far from the prying eyes of anyone who might know us. Jake was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with a cup of coffee in front of him. He looked up as I approached, his expression a mix of relief and apprehension. "Thanks for meeting me," he said as I sat down. I nodded, my heart racing as I tried to find the right words. "I'm not sure if I should," I began. "I understand," he said quietly, "but I needed to see you, to talk about everything." I took a deep breath, the weight of the conversation ahead settling over me. "Jake, what happened between us can't happen again." "I know," he said quickly. "I'm not here to ask for that. I needed to tell you how much you mean to me, how much you've always meant to me." His words caught me off guard, and I felt a lump form in my throat. "Jake, you mean so much to me too," I said softly. "But what we did was wrong. We both know that." He nodded, his gaze dropping to the table. "I know, and I'm sorry for putting you in that position." I didn't know how to deal with everything I was feeling. Neither did I admitted, but we need to move forward. We need to put this behind us and focus on rebuilding our relationship in a way that's healthy. Jake looked up at me, his eyes filled with sadness but also understanding. I want that too, he said. I don't want to lose you, Uncle Alex. You won't, I said firmly. But we need boundaries for both our sakes. He nodded again, and for the first time, I saw a glimmer of hope in his expression. Thank you, he said softly, for giving me a chance to talk about this. Always, I said, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. You'll always have a place in my life, Jake, but we need to keep it as it should be. The conversation ended on a bittersweet note, and as we went our separate ways, I felt a sense of relief mixed with lingering sadness. It wasn't the resolution I had hoped for, but it was a step in the right direction, a step toward healing and moving forward. In the weeks that followed, things slowly began to return to normal. Jake visited the house more often, his interactions with me careful but genuine. Mark remained oblivious to the tension that had once existed, his focus on his own routine. While the memories of that night still lingered, they became easier to bear with time. I found solace in the knowledge that Jake and I were working to rebuild our relationship, to find a way back to the bond we had once shared. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when the weight of our past threatened to pull me under. But each day was a step forward, a step toward forgiveness and understanding. As I sat in the living room one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for weeks. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't easy, but it was enough for now. That was all I could ask for. And as the light faded, I whispered a quiet prayer for the strength to keep moving forward, for myself, for Jake, and for the future we were working to build. Thank you so much for watching this emotional and heartfelt story. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more touching LGBT stories. Don't forget to leave a comment below and share your thoughts on this powerful tale. Your support means the world to us. Until next time, stay kind and stay connected. Bye.